24 hours before the operation began, Ibrahim Traoré met with the team leader one last time. If you're caught, Burkina Faso will disavow you. Your diplomatic passport will be invalidated. If you die, we can't even notify your family. The commando chief simply nodded. They both knew that retrieving artifacts stolen from Africa 300 years ago from Europe's most heavily guarded museums would require far more than diplomatic channels. The secure bunker beneath the presidential palace in Ouagadougou was silent as Ibrahim Traoré studied the 5 specialists before him. Their civilian clothes couldn't disguise their military-bearing elite soldiers chosen for this unprecedented mission, a mission that, if discovered, could result in international sanctions against Burkina Faso, or worse. Operation Gateway proceeds tomorrow night, Traoré said, activating a holographic display showing detailed floor plans of 5 European museums: the British Museum, the Louvre, the Humboldt Forum, Tervuren, and Pitt Rivers. For 2 years, we've requested the return of our artifacts. Through proper channels, their response has been condescension and delay, Colonel. Amara Awi, the team leader, nodded grimly. 247 items on our primary list. Mr. President, sacred objects taken during colonization and now coming home. True, replied Dr. Numa. We'll brief you on the cultural protocols for handling each artifact. Delawo has prepared your electronic counter measures. Mensa has analyzed all security systems. Sanu has established your extraction routes. The team's faces revealed no emotion, but Traoré knew what this mission meant to each of them personally. Nkrumah's great-grandfather had been the guardian of a ceremonial drum now displayed in London. Mensa's village still performed dances around an empty altar where a sacred mask had once rested before French troops took it in 1897. These weren't just historical objects. They were living connections to ancestors, spiritual foundations of communities still practicing there. Traditions. What we do tonight, we do not for Burkina Faso alone, but for all of Africa. True concluded. Questions. There were none. The plan had been rehearsed for months. Each team member had created cover identities, visited their target museums, repeatedly mapped every security measure. As the team filed out, True called Colonel Oia back. Amara, a personal request. He handed her a wooden box containing a photograph of an ornate golden mask, the Mask of Moyonaba. My grandfather was its guardian before French troops took it. It's not in any museum. It's in the Devo Foundation's private collection in London. A side mission. Oia said. High risk. Completely optional. True clarified. Oia studied the photograph, then nodded. Consider it done, Mr. President. That evening, while his team made final preparations, Traoré stood alone on the palace balcony, contemplating the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. The political and diplomatic risks were enormous. If discovered, his country would face severe international consequences. His presidency, perhaps even his freedom, hung in the balance. Yet the stories his grandfather had told him of French soldiers tearing the sacred mask from his hands, of community elders weeping as their spiritual treasures were loaded onto colonial ships, of ceremonies left hollow without their sacred objects. These memories outweighed any personal risk. Some justice cannot wait for diplomatic convenience. He murmured a phrase his mentor had often repeated at 2:14 a.m. in London. Curator Dr. Elizabeth Harlow was working late at the British Museum, preparing an exhibition called Treasures of the Colonial Era. She didn't notice the slight flicker of the security monitors or the momentary disruption in the building's power grid in the security room. Guard James Thornton suppressed a yawn as he scanned the bank of monitors. Had he been more alert, he might have noticed the 3-second loop in camera 14's feed, a digital fingerprint of intrusion so subtle that only the most sophisticated systems would detect it by the time the first alarm triggered at 2:17 a.m. Colonel Oa's team had already accessed the African galleries and secured their primary targets. Dr. Nkrumah whispered traditional phrases of respect as each sacred object was placed in custom-designed preservation containers, ironically far superior to the museum's display cases in terms of temperature and humidity control. Diallo maintained electronic countermeasures, temporarily blinding security systems, just long enough for the team to complete their work. Mensa disabled and re-enabled pressure sensors with such precision that the system registered no interruption for minutes after entering the gallery. They had secured 17 priority artifacts. Similar scenarios were unfolding simultaneously in Paris, Berlin, Brussels, and Oxford. Each team moved with precision, disabling and re-enabling security systems with such expertise that in most cases, the absence of artifacts wouldn't be noticed until morning staff arrived after securing the museum. Artifacts. Oia made a detour to the Devo Foundation. 3 blocks away, within minutes, she had bypassed its security and retrieved the Mask of Mo Naba from its custom-lit display case. Forgive the delay. She whispered to the mask, "But your people have been waiting for your return much longer." French President Marcel Beaumont was awakened at 3:30 a.m. by an urgent call. "Mr. President, we have a situation." The Louvre, the British Museum, the Humboldt Forum, all reporting significant thefts from their African collections. Preliminary reports suggest a coordinated operation. Beaumont sat up, instantly alert casualties. "None, sir. The perpetrators bypassed security without confrontation. Professional job, then terrorist. Groups unknown, sir, but the targets were specific, only African artifacts." With colonial-era acquisition histories, Beaumont frowned. "Give me the British Prime Minister and the German Chancellor and contact our intelligence services. I want to know who's behind this." By morning, similar conversations were occurring in government offices across Europe. Security agencies, mobilized museum directors were summoned for emergency meetings. Interpol established a special task force within hours. Yet for all the urgent response, the perpetrators had vanished, leaving minimal evidence. Security footage showed only brief, unexplained gaps. Alarm systems recorded no malfunctions. The few security guards who glimpsed shadowy figures provided contradictory descriptions. Most puzzling to investigators was the surgical precision of the operation. No display cases were broken. No alarms had sounded until after the artifacts were removed. Nothing was damaged. This wasn't common theft, concluded Interpol's lead investigator. This was a repatriation operation, executed with military precision. As dawn broke over Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré received confirmation Operation Gateway had succeeded beyond expectations. 87 artifacts recovered from the British Museum, 64 from the Louvre, 43 from the Humboldt Forum, 31 from Tervuren, 22 from Pitt Rivers. And in a development that brought him unexpected personal joy, Colonel O.C. had secured the mask of Munaba from the DeVoe Foundation. The artifacts were en route to Burkina Faso via a complex network of diplomatic pouches, private aircraft, and secure transport channels established months in advance. Within 72 hours, they would arrive at a specially constructed preservation facility in Ouagadougou, one built to the highest international standards, staffed by African conservators trained at the world's top institutions. Traoré allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before preparing for the storm that would follow. The diplomatic crisis was inevitable. The accusations would be severe, but for the first time in centuries, these sacred objects were returning home. His office was flooded with diplomatic communications, demands for information, thinly veiled accusations, threats of consequences. European ambassadors requested urgent meetings. International organizations issued statements of concern. Major news outlets carried headlines about the largest museum heist in history, with speculation about terrorist involvement or organized crime. Traoré's response to all inquiries was the same carefully crafted statement. Burkina Faso has no knowledge of these events, but has long supported the rightful return of African cultural heritage to its countries of origin. For 7 days, he maintained this position, neither confirming nor denying involvement, while European investigators found themselves at increasingly frustrating dead ends. The operation had been too clean, too professional to leave an evidence trail leading back to Ouagadougou. Meanwhile, the recovered artifacts were arriving at the new preservation facility, where conservators carefully documented their condition, noting with professional disapproval the inadequate preservation methods that had been applied to many pieces during their European captivity. Some wooden masks showed signs of pest. Damaged metal objects displayed corrosion from improper humidity control. Textile pieces had faded under excessive light exposure. These detailed condition reports would later prove crucial in countering European claims about superior conservation capabilities. On the seventh day, Traoré called a press conference with just 2 hours' notice. International media scrambled to secure positions in the crowded room at Burkina Faso's presidential palace. Ibrahim Traoré entered without ceremony, dressed in his customary military uniform. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady. "For the past week, the world has discussed what some call a theft and others call a recovery. Today, I will address these events directly." The room fell silent, cameras focused intently on his face. 325 years ago, European powers began systematically looting Africa's cultural heritage, sacred objects, royal insignia, religious artifacts, all taken by force to fill Western museums and private collections. For decades, African nations have requested their return through diplomatic channels. We have been met with delays, excuses, and patronizing lectures about preservation standards. Traoré pressed a button, and the wall behind him transformed into a video screen showing the interior of a state-of-the-art preservation facility. "I invite the international museum community to inspect our new African Heritage Preservation Center. built to exceed international conservation standards, staffed by African specialists trained at the world's leading institutions. It stands ready to properly care for our cultural patrimony. The screen changed to show specific artifacts, now carefully displayed in climate-controlled cases. These objects are not merely art. They are not curiosities for foreign visitors to photograph. They are living connections to our ancestors, integral components of ongoing cultural practices, the foundation of our spiritual and historical identity. His expression intensified. Burkina Faso acknowledges its role in recovering these artifacts. We do so without apology. What was taken by force has been returned by precision. No one was harmed. Nothing was damaged. After centuries in foreign lands, these sacred objects have come home. The room erupted with questions. Traoré raised a hand for silence to the governments of Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium. We are prepared to discuss this matter through diplomatic channels. We are open to cultural exchange programs, temporary exhibitions, and knowledge sharing. But the era of permanent European possession of Africa's heritage is over with. That he stepped away from the podium, ignoring the shouted questions. As he exited, the international response was immediate and polarized. European governments issued formal condemnations. The British Prime Minister called it a criminal act against world heritage. The French president demanded immediate return of stolen cultural property. Museums released statements expressing concern for the proper preservation of irreplaceable artifacts. Interpol launched an investigation. Security footage was analyzed. Diplomatic pressure mounted on African nations suspected of involvement. Yet, alongside the official outrage, another narrative was emerging. Museum curators quietly acknowledged the superior conservation conditions at Burkina Faso's new facility. Art historians noted the ethical questions surrounding colonial era acquisitions. Cultural rights advocates praised the return of sacred objects to practicing communities. In the weeks that followed, the international community grappled with the implications of what media had dubbed the Great Repatriation. Legal experts debated, museums reassessed security, governments issued threats, then tentatively opened dialogues. 3 developments proved particularly significant. First, several African nations publicly supported Burkina Faso's position with Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Egypt, suggesting they might pursue similar measures if diplomatic requests continued to be ignored. Second, public opinion, particularly among younger generations, globally showed surprising support for the repatriation, with hashtags like "Bring Them Home" and "African Artifacts Returned" trending across social media platforms. Third, and most unexpectedly, renowned international conservation experts who visited Burkina Faso's new preservation facility reported that the recovered artifacts were in fact receiving superior care compared to their previous conditions in European institutions. 2 months after the operation, Ibrahim Traoré received a private message from the British Prime Minister requesting a confidential meeting. In Geneva, similar communications arrived from French and German leaders. The tone had shifted from demands to diplomacy. The Geneva Conference, as it came to be known, marked a turning point in the relationship between European museums and African nations. Over 5 days of intense negotiation, a framework emerged for addressing colonial-era acquisitions. Ibrahim Traoré, now recognized as the driving force behind this historical reckoning, presented African demands: clearly full repatriation of sacred and royal artifacts, shared stewardship of certain historical items, and formal acknowledgement of the colonial looting that had dispersed Africa's heritage. European representatives, initially resistant, gradually shifted their position as Traoré presented detailed evidence of the superior conservation methods at the new African facilities, the cultural importance of the artifacts to living communities, and most persuasively, documentation of how many museums had neglected these treasures while refusing to return them. On the final day, a landmark agreement was signed, the Heritage Repatriation and Cultural Cooperation Accord. Its provisions would transform the museum world: a scheduled return of over 0 African artifacts over 5 years, joint conservation programs, funding for African preservation facilities, and new models for international exhibition that respected originating cultures. Leaving the conference, the French culture minister was overheard remarking to a colleague, "Traoré has accomplished in 3 months what diplomatic channels couldn't achieve in 50 years. 1 year later, Ibrahim Traoré stood in Burkina Faso's new National Museum of Cultural Heritage. Around him, visitors moved reverently through galleries displaying artifacts that many had previously seen only in photographs. Sacred objects their grandparents had told stories about, treasures that connected them to their ancestors. The museum had become a symbol of African cultural renaissance, attracting visitors from across the continent and beyond. More significantly, it had inspired similar institutions throughout Africa as the repatriation process continued in a quiet corner away from the main galleries. True paused before a special display. The mask of Monaba, his grandfather's sacred charge, finally returned. Beside it stood an elderly man, tears streaming down his face. My father spoke of this mask, the man said softly, not recognizing Traoré without his presidential attire. He said its return would signal a new era for our people. Traoré nodded. And has that new era begun, elder? The man considered this, then smiled. Yes, not just because the mask has returned, but because we brought it back ourselves. We did not ask permission. We did not beg. We acted as a sovereign people, reclaiming what is rightfully ours. As Traoré moved to leave, the man asked, do you think the Europeans have learned from this? Traoré paused. Some have, others resist. But the important thing is that we have learned that our heritage is worth fighting for, that our demands deserve respect, and that when diplomatic channels fail, decisive action succeeds. 5 years after Operation Gateway, the landscape of international cultural heritage had been fundamentally transformed. The Heritage Repatriation Accord had expanded to include museums in North America, Australia, and Asia. Over 18 African artifacts had been returned to their countries of origin, with thousands more scheduled for repatriation. The precedent established by Burkina Faso had inspired similar movements. Worldwide, indigenous communities in the Americas, Aboriginal groups in Australia, and formerly colonized nations in Asia had successfully negotiated the return of their cultural patrimony using the framework established by the Accord. Ibrahim Traoré had become an international figure, invited to speak at prestigious universities and global forums about cultural sovereignty and historical justice, yet he remained focused on his primary goal: building Burkina Faso into a model of African self-determination. The National Museum had expanded into a cultural heritage complex, including research facilities, conservation laboratories, and educational centers that attracted scholars and students from around the world. Burkina Faso's expertise in artifact preservation had become internationally recognized, inverting the colonial narrative that Africans couldn't properly care for their own heritage. Most significantly, the artifacts themselves had been reintegrated into the cultural life of their communities. The sacred drums of the Bobo, people once more called the ancestors during ceremonies, the royal staff of the Mossy Kings, again stood as a symbol of legitimate authority. The masks of the boa danced in festivals for the first time in generations. What European museums had treated as static art objects had become once again living components of vibrant cultural traditions. As evening fell, Traoré stood on his office balcony watching the lights of the cultural heritage complex glow in the distance. He thought about his grandfather, who had died, never knowing what happened to the sacred mask he had sworn to protect. He thought about generations of Africans who had lived and died without seeing their cultural treasures. We did it, he whispered to the night air. We brought them home. In museums across Europe, empty display cases bore small plaques. This artifact has been returned to its country of origin as part of the Heritage Repatriation Accord. Each empty space represented not just an absent object, but a shift in the global order, a recognition that sometimes historical wrongs require bold actions to make right. The operation that had begun in secrecy had ended in transformation. The gateway to Africa's heritage had been reopened, and through it had passed not just artifacts returning home, but a new understanding of justice, sovereignty, and the power of reclaiming one's cultural identity.